Well, it's good to see you all again. I've been off on holidays for a month, and I'm really looking forward to just catching back up and from where we left off and seeing what's happened. But it's not exactly true for me to say see you, because you're seeing me, but in reality it's Friday afternoon for me, and it's probably Sunday or Monday sometime for you. And I'm not seeing you. We're not in person, but on Monday, the session's having a vote as to whether to open worship back up the following Sunday. And just from what I've seen, I don't like to predict these things, and I don't like to try and sort of put ideas in people's heads or anything. But I do suspect that vote will pass. I think everybody's pretty eager to get back to church, and we were kind of ready before I went on holidays, but trying to do church differently with pulpit supply during COVID and everything. We said we'd wait till I came back and have a plan in place, and they do, and we're voting on that Monday, so tomorrow from when the video goes out. But anyway, so that's exciting. I do want to assure anybody that's not comfortable coming back to church, the online worship is going to continue. It's going to change a little bit because I'm going to try and bring the two together. I just don't have time to do two services each week without giving up other important stuff. So this is going to continue. It's going to change a bit, and in-person worship's going to change. We're not allowed to sing. We're not allowed to have fellowship, like coffee after the service. Whatever you do on the sidewalk is your business, but we're responsible for the property, and we're obligated to ask you to behave yourselves. And so anyway, there's things that we can't do, and that's going to shift the way we do worship on Sunday. And so anyway, I've got some, I think, pretty cool ideas to bring it together and try different things. But yeah, so if you want to watch from home, feel free to do that. If you want to watch from a pew, you can do that too. Now, some people don't want to be on camera, and I'm not a big fan of just recording a worship service and throwing it up online. To me, that's maybe advertising, like maybe that's a way that someone can see whether they'd like to be part of church in person down the line. But to me, that's not a worshipful experience, and it's actually really hard to do properly. You got to have expensive cameras, good lighting, a really good soundboard, editing software, the whole bit that we don't have the people, let alone the money for that. And to be quite frank, I'm filming outside because the light is usually right outside, and I am filming on an iPhone strapped to a tree. So I think it's pretty amazing what you can do with very little these days, but I'm not ready to film a worship service and just put it up like that. So we'll be careful, and we'll sort of meld the two as appropriately as we can. So you'll have to make that decision whether you feel that you need to be at church or whether you need to be at home, and we'll just try and support both of you. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about Psalm 149. And the reason I'm talking about Psalm 149 is just, especially when you're back from holidays and you're not kind of caught up on how everybody is and where everybody is yet, it can be really tough to choose a worship service. And often I just will look at a list. The lectionary puts out this time of year, there's 6 passages per Sunday. And I usually just look for the one that speaks to me. And this week, it was Psalm 149. And the reason was it was just so celebratory. It was just, yes, this is good. Even though things aren't always good, we are celebrating, we are happy, we are, God is good, and I thought, yes, that is what we need right now. It may not feel that way, but I think there's a lot to be said for that. So to talk about, to get to that, I actually want to start with the end of the psalm, which is kind of depressing. And the reason for that is it's all about Israel vanquishing the enemies with the sword. And, that causes me to pause. I hope it causes you to pause. It doesn't cause everyone to pause, because some people just, this is it. But, if I'm not a pacifist, I'm pretty close to it. And so anytime we're talking about fighting physically, I have problems with that. And so I think the question to go for, to look at there is, who is Israel cutting down? Who is Israel fighting with? Who is the enemy in this situation? And obviously, because politics and religion were so intertwined in those days, and national identity, in ways that we can't even fathom anymore because our world is so different. Their enemies, not only were they the enemies theologically, which we'll talk more about, but they are also the national enemies. Let's recognize that. Let's recognize that when Israel's talking about taking down the enemies, they are talking about the neighbors that not only are a competing nationality, but are a competing ideology as well. And we have problems with that today, and I think we really should. But for them, 3,000 years ago, they couldn't see the difference. It was just, that's just how it was. Yeah. So I think, this is an eschatological psalm, and eschatology is things about the end times, and that's often really negative. We think of movies and stuff about the end times, but it's not supposed to be a bad thing. It's supposed to be a really exciting thing, because this is the promise that despite what we see around us right now, the world will be perfected. The world, injustice, inequality, lack of basic human things, all of that will be wiped out. And we will be able to be our true selves the way we were intended to be. We will be supported to live in harmony and live in this beautiful, wonderful world that right now is almost hard to imagine. That's sort of what the psalm is celebrating. It's saying, well, things aren't great right now. We have these enemies that we kind of want to vanquish by the sword. We're scared, but man, we've got this promise. This is exciting. And so that's what they're celebrating, but it begs the question of who is the enemy of that message? So again, for Israel, because their nationality and their theology were wrapped up together to a problematic degree by modern standards, and that's why we've developed and changed. Their enemies were also their neighbors, but it's also the people that just oppose peace and justice. In their perspective, they would have said, okay, the way to peace and justice is through this law that God has given to us. Therefore, anybody that's not part of us is against this great message of peace and justice, et cetera, et cetera. But, even the Christian church is a pretty fractious, well, I shouldn't say even. The Christian church is one of the most fractious groups in the world. You can't look at it the way Israel was looking at it 3,000 years ago. Remember, these were tribal cultures. The kings really were just what we would call today warlords. It was looked at differently, and it was different times, but that was the reality. So the idea is, this psalm is saying, overcome anybody that's the enemy of peace. Overcome anybody that is the enemy of equality. Overcome anybody that is the enemy of, having enough food. Who are those people? Who are the people that don't like it when things are equal? Who are the people that have a vested interest in injustice, right? That's what it's getting at. I think, if you look at violence as a language, violence was the language of the time. And too often it's still the language of the time, but we need to seriously think about that. And I caution you against that. But language is the violence was the language of the time. Therefore, this violence is saying we're looking for complete and utter peace, right? And so what it's not saying, from Israel's perspective 3,000 years ago, it was saying that Israel's enemies and God's enemies were the same thing. But what it's saying to us today is is something different. And I think if we look at it through the lens of a gospel, that becomes more clear. If you look up Mark 9, verses 38 to 39, you can pause it if you like, or you can look it up later. That's Mark 9, 38 to 39. That's the passage where Jesus says, whoever's not against us is for us. The disciples were upset that some people were casting out demons in Jesus' name, but they weren't really disciples, or they weren't really Jesus followers. They weren't part of the in-group. I think we could probably guess that they were doing it improperly or in a way that wouldn't have been approved. And Jesus says, you know what, don't stop them. They may not be with us, but they're not against us, and that means they're working towards the same thing we're working towards. And so think about Psalm 149 through that lens. So when we're talking about who's against us, when we're talking about enemies, we're talking about people who have a vested interest in injustice. I think there's also a case where there's, it's complicated today because there's a lot of people that have been misled. The church has a lot of people that are arguing and fighting against it, and that's because we have done misleading things. We have done wrong things. We have tainted our own message, and people are looking at that and they're angry at us, and rightly so. Not always rightly so. I think there's a lot of misinformation about the church and misunderstanding out there, but we've also done some bad things. So, there's people that are against our message that have been misled about our message and maybe continuing to be misled. But generally, the Psalm's talking about people that don't want a peaceful world. And so I guess the question comes back to, what are we celebrating? And, I think the key verse here, or it's even a portion of a verse, is he adorns the humble with victory. Who are the humble? Humble are not people that I see fighting for their way. They're not the people that I see at the end of the psalm, even though they're talking about victory. Again, that was the language of the time. But the humble are not the people that I see picking up a sword and fighting and doing all that stuff that we don't agree with. The humble are the people that are setting themselves aside so that God can actually do something through them. They're the people that are not clinging to what they know or what makes them comfortable or whatever. They're saying, you know what, regardless of the risk to me, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to listen, because God is doing something beautiful. God is doing something wonderful, and God can be doing that wonderful thing through me. I think that's pretty wonderful. And that's the resurrection message. We're all about the resurrection, and I don't like to talk about the factuality of it or anything like that. But what I do like to talk about is simply the fact that we are about the end not being the end. If we're fighting for ourselves, if we're fighting for our own survival and our own position and things like that, if we're sort of defending ourselves, then we're probably benefiting from that injustice. We've probably suddenly become the people that the end of the psalm is talking about, the enemies of fairness. If we want to elevate ourselves or protect ourselves, that whole idea of protecting ourselves can be dangerous. Then all of a sudden we have a vested interest in injustice, right? So the resurrection is all about saying, I'm going to set myself aside. I'm going to sacrifice myself. I'm going to, come what may. Jesus said, are you going to, go ahead, kill me. That's what Jesus said. It's not going to stop the message. Killing me is not going to kill God. That's the whole point. God is going to continue to do things through me. God did things through Rome. Rome was a negative actor in the gospel story, but I would argue that the Gospels couldn't really happen at any other time and place in history. Rome was an important actor. God used Rome. And so I think it's so important to remember that if we can set ourselves aside, if we can not be the people that the end of the gospel is talking about, then there's so much to celebrate, because God is taking us on an incredible journey. And I am excited to see where that journey goes.